Thank you, Greta, and thank you to the organisers, David Morgan and Steve Cushion, and for the Socialist History Society for inviting me along to talk about my new book. It's Prophets and Witches, and the subtitle is important: Witchcraft, Gender and Politics in Revolutionary England. And this is why I think my talk follows on very nicely from some of your recent talks on the works of Christopher Hill and the religious politics of this really interesting period. So my book is out. It was published in August of last year, so it's out and can be read and looked at. So let's start. Why a book about prophets and witches? And why the English Civil War period? So I'd like to start with, my interest in the English Revolutionary period, and especially the role of religion and women in this context, began way back in my undergraduate years in the 1980s, studying the fascinating world of religious radicalism of these times, and especially the history of ideas. I was interested in the doctrines of social and gender equality that were central to much of the religious sectarian teaching, especially amongst the diggers, the levellers, and especially the Quakers, who emerged as the dominant religious sect of the 1650s. I became interested in radical ideas for social justice, anti-power and corruption in both church and state, and even doctrines of equality for women, including, as you'll see in my book, support for women's preaching and prophesying. So I want to mention the early influence of the works of Christopher Hill, the subject of one of your recent talks, especially his book, The World Turned Upside Down, first published in 1972, which introduced me to the fascinating world of English Civil War religious radicalism and sectarianism. Now, back in the and we're talking the 70s and 80s, women in history were by and large still a mere footnote or added paragraph in the history books. Pioneering works such as Sheila Rowbotham's Hidden from History, Rediscovering Women in History from the 17th Century, published in 1975, highlighted the absence of women in history texts and the need to redress this glaring imbalance. Gradually, things began to change, with feminist historians researching and writing on women's past experiences. This included works on women's agency and influence in early modern society. My interest was then provoked in researching the role of women as preachers in the English Revolutionary period between 1640 and 1660. Importantly, at a time when women were advised to be silent, modest, and obedient to their husbands, their identity as God's chosen prophets or divine instruments allowed women to push through gender constraints. The upheavals and increased religious enthusiasm of the revolutionary period opened the door for women to claim spiritual authority. This earlier work on women's prophecy then intersected with my more recent research in the history of English witchcraft and the persecution of women as witches. This led to a PhD and then my recently published monograph, Prophets and Witches, which explores the slippery categories of the prophet and witch and asks the question, why were women who claimed spiritual authority as prophets during the revolutionary period, vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. To address this question, the book considers the roles of both gender and politics in response to women's prophecy and the construction of the witch. Now, most studies of women's prophecy and witchcraft either focus on gender or politics. My book brings together both of these key elements, as I argue. I want to acknowledge the work and the influence of Peter Elmer, who has done extensive work on the role of politics in English witchcraft during this period. There is also much English witchcraft history by historians such as Lyndall Roper, one of your recent speakers, Ronald Hutton, Diane Purkis, James Sharp, Marion Gibson, to name a few. My book examines the crucial role of gender in witchcraft persecutions. Now, we must remember that 90% of accused witches in the early modern period were women. There were some men, but 90% were women. But my book also explores the role of witchcraft within its broader political and religious context. To this end, the witch is not merely viewed as a stereotypical representation of the malevolent old woman with her familiars and broomstick, casting spells and using magic to cause harm, but witchcraft in my book emerges as a persecutory, rhetorical implement to attack religious and political opponents. To understand the fluidity of the early modern prophet and witch, my book posits that context is crucial. The English Civil War period saw not only the social and psychological trauma of widespread warfare, but unprecedented political and religious upheavals, with the overthrow of the monarchy, the execution of the king, and Cromwell's 10-year rule, but also the weakened authority of the Church of England, which made way for the spread of independent churches and sectarian religions. During this time, political and religious dispute took place in the public marketplace, but also in the many thousands of published pamphlets which flew off the printing presses. Historians estimate some 22,000 pamphlets, broadsheets and manuscripts published between 1640 to 1660. I have a few of these on the slide here. Some of you may be familiar with Thomas Edwards' Gangrena, which was a catalogue of all the religious sects and their terrible heresies. Edwards was a Presbyterian minister. A Justification of Independent Churches by Catherine Chidley, and Reasons Against Independent Churches. And this one here is an attack on independence and lay preaching. So the very rich pamphlets that are with us today that historians can delve into, these are my main sources for the book, looking at these fascinating pamphlets and how they talk about women as prophets and use witchcraft as a term of persecution against their enemies. The key disputes were between those advocating for church establishment. This included both Church of England advocates, but also Presbyterians, who with this weakened church saw their opportunity for establishment. They were arguing against those who were defending religious toleration and independence. Importantly, this also drew battle lines between the learned ordained ministry and lay sectarian preachers, and this included women preachers and prophets. Max Weber referred to this as the prophet-priest contest, where the learned ministry struggled to maintain its authority against the rise of a new prophetic ministry of the Spirit. So I put my women into this context of religious debate, and I put them at the centre of it, not on the periphery. So another important context was that of early modern witchcraft belief. Now, although nothing like the mass witch hunts witnessed in Reformation Europe, with thousands of women questioned, tortured, or executed on the charge of witchcraft, or the brutal witchcraft persecutions to the north in Scotland did have three distinct periods of witchcraft persecution. There were the Essex witch hunts of 1580 to 1620, where there were 400 accused witches, 53 of whom were executed. Many of you will have heard of the Pendle witches of 1612, 16 accused witches, 10 executed. Now, England in the 1640s, the English Civil War period, was also a period of intensified witchcraft belief and witch hunting. Matthew Hopkins, the famous witch finder general, led the East Anglia witch hunts of 1645 to 47, with 250 accused and 100 or more executed by hanging. Witches were accused of entering a pact with the devil to perform harmful magic. Now, while debates about the nature and reality of witchcraft took place within learned elite circles, in the popular psyche, fear of the devil and belief in witchcraft was widespread, especially the power of the witch, with the aid of the devil, to perform acts of maleficia or doing harm. Belief in magic, such as fairies and other supernatural spirits, was already firmly embedded in English popular culture. And by the 1500s, there were fears about women as witches, women who were in league with the devil and used harmful magic against neighbours, the unborn child, or livestock. Elderly spinster women, women as healers, and midwives, as you could imagine, were especially vulnerable to witchcraft persecution. The other dominant feature of English witchcraft was that of the witch's familiar. And you can see on the slide here, the witch's familiar, often it could be a black cat or a toad, who assisted the witch with her evil magic. Now, King James VI of Scotland was known for his fear of witches and published Demonology in 1597. He argued the existence of witchcraft skeptics. When he became King James I of England in 1603, he brought with him his strong belief in witches and harmful magic, and his Demonology became an influential English witchcraft text. like the European Reformation, the political, religious, and social upheavals of the English Civil War created a perfect storm for witch hunting and witch belief. It unleashed the widespread belief that Satan was let loose in England. And as my book demonstrates, references to witchcraft and the devil featured in religious and political debate and polemical discourses of these turbulent times. Now, the book begins and features the female prophet, Anna Trapnell. She is actually the figure on the front of the book, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in the talk. The book begins in January 1651 in Whitehall, London, with the visionary prophet Anna Trapnell lying in trance in a small bedchamber at Mr. Roberts' inn. There on a bed for 12 days and 11 nights, taking no food, just a little toast in small beer, she moved between periods of silence, prophetic declaration, and spiritual song. A bedside scribe, an eyewitness, described the spectacle of her visionary performance and wrote down her many prophetic declarations concerning church and state. Word spread of Trapnell's visionary trance, with, quote, many hundreds daily filing into the small room at the inn to observe the compelling performance and heed the prophet's visionary warnings. Trapnell was closely associated with the London-based radical, independent, millenarian Fifth Monarchist Church. Her visionary utterances during what became known as her Whitehall trance were published in two works in 1654, The Cry of the Stone and the abridged Strange and Wonderful News from Whitehall. Her prophecies drew on the fiery apocalyptic language and imagery of the books of Daniel and Revelations. She experienced visions of the beast with the four horns and the great oaks, which she claimed represented Cromwell and all corrupt powers soon to be cast out. She declared God's Spirit was above all outward rulers, religion, and ministries, and Christ would now rule through his daughters, handmaids, or prophets. So you can see why women's prophecy did raise a few eyebrows amongst the political and religious establishment. Now, Trapnell was one of several women during the political and religious conflicts of the English revolutionary years of the 1640s and 50s who attracted attention as prophets. Historian Phyllis Mack identifies some 270 female prophets active in London and various English counties between 1640 and 1665. Some of these women acted alone, achieving individual status as prophets, but most were found amongst the many independent churches and sectarian religions of the time, most notably among the Quakers of the 1650s. And indeed, I must stress that in this context, preaching and prophecy amounted to much the same thing, as both involved declaration through divine inspiration. Now, female prophecy came in many forms and included spiritual writing, prayer, and declaration, or sometimes visions and songs uttered while in ecstatic trance. It included millenarian warning of Christ's return and rule and the collapse of political and religious powers. Therefore, contemporary audiences not only viewed these women as passive spiritual vessels, but also as politically disruptive. Now, on the slide here, I've got some early Christian examples of prophets, such as Debra. I've got some Quaker prophets, this one here, prophesying, and Anna Trapnell with the devil behind her here. Chapter 1 in the book examines women's prophetic writings. A whole genre exists, and it uncovers the power and perceived threat, excuse me, of female prophecy. These women embrace the biblical trope of women as the weaker vessel to assert their superior status as conduits for the power of God's Spirit. The combative and fiery apocalyptic rhetoric of female prophecy posed a direct challenge to political powers, as well as the religious authority of the church and learned ministry. It positions these women firmly within the dominant power contest between institutional religious authority and the rule of God's Spirit. The next chapter unpacks the various definitions of the early modern prophet and witch and how these seeming opposites could easily overlap. Essentially, contemporary audiences understood the prophet as one who spoke for God or the divine spirit, while the witch entered a pact with the devil. But as the book demonstrates, the divide between the demonic and the divine was unclear, as any claim to divine or godly inspiration could be met with skepticism or easily be interpreted as demonic witchcraft. In this context, prophecy itself was understood not only as a gift of foretelling, but in much broader terms as spiritual declaration or God speaking through his chosen vessel. In his Leviathan in 1651, Thomas Hobbes defined the prophet as both foreteller and forthteller, arguing it was more the latter that was commonly applied. That is, one whom God speaketh to immediately. The witch, by contrast, was guided by the devil. So essentially, the prophet is divine while the witch is demonic, one good, one evil. But as my book asks, was it this clear cut? To illustrate the slippery divine-demonic divide, the book returns to the prophet Anna Trapnell, who, following the success of her Whitehall trance in 1654, travelled to Cornwall later that year to expand her prophetic activity. Staying at the homes of her fifth monarchist religious allies and supporters, she again fell into a prolonged visionary trance, drawing the curious to her bedchamber and window. Excuse me. However, on this occasion, Trapnell's prophesying provoked the unwanted attention of local church authorities and magistrates. She was arrested and tried for witchcraft in a courtroom in Truro. Trapnell recalls how at the scene of her arrest, the local Presbyterian minister had called out a witch. And then at her trial, she says that she narrowly avoided the witch trier and her great pin. They used to prick the witch with, there's some pictures of the witch's pin here to test for the devil's mark to see if the woman was a witch. Trapnell was, however, charged with creating a disturbance and stirring up rebellion, and she was transported back to London to spend 3 months in Bridewell prison. Now, Trapnell published her report and plea, there's on the slide here, as a defiance against her religious and political enemies and as a rebuttal of the witchcraft charges. She protested, quote, England's rulers and clergy do judge the Lord's handmaid to be mad and under the administration of evil angels and a witch, and many other evil terms they raise up to make me odious and abhorred in the hearts of good and bad, unquote. In her defence, Trapnell asserted, quote, I saw their downfall and I told of it, so they could not abide me, unquote. This example demonstrates the attempts by religious and political authorities to silence an outspoken female prophet by constructing her as a witch. And the prophet here, Anna Trapnell, calls out the powers on this. Now, another illustration of the slippery prophet-witch categories is that of the female prophet Elizabeth Poole. Now, she gained notoriety for her prophetic declarations concerning matters of church and state, which gave her access to the halls of power. She was brought before Cromwell and Parliament, where she advised against the execution of the king and prophesied on other state and military matters of interest to Cromwell and the Army Council. An account of Poole's prophesying and the construction of the prophet as a witch appeared in the anti-Cromwellian pamphlet, The English Devil, or Cromwell and His Monstrous Witch. This is in the top right of the screen here. Now, the anonymous author, however, also revealed his wider political and religious agenda. The title page image, as you can see, depicts a stereotypical witch feeding her familiars. She has some toads here that she's feeding. Arguing in support of the monarchy, the pamphleteer labelled Cromwell the grand impostor. And denounced his government for establishing a toleration of all religions. The author mocks Cromwell and other key military figures for receiving the prophetess with her strange postures at Whitehall and for foolishly believing this witch to be God sent. Although Poole was not arrested or tried as a witch like Trapnell, both examples demonstrate the broader political and religious power agendas at play in the construction of female prophets as witches. Now, as I've already highlighted, the devil played a pivotal role in English witchcraft belief and also in witches' confessions during witch trials. He was sometimes portrayed as a gentleman in a black suit. You can see down here, this slide at the bottom, who seduced the witch. So the witch would say in her confessions, "The devil made me do it." It was also a widely held belief that woman's natural weakness left her the more vulnerable to Satan's powers and deceptions. The book's cover image, this is here at the bottom, illustrates an attractional and the devil standing behind as if controlling and seducing the prophetess. It illustrates how easily a woman as a prophet could be constructed as the devil's instrument and therefore a witch. Now, the danger for the female prophet as a spiritual receptor was this slippery divide between the godly and the demonic spirit in the eyes of her audience. The New Testament contains several reminders to be wary of the deceptions of demonic or unclean spirits and the imperative to discern the spirits in the earthly host to be sure they are of God. Jesus warned that at the end of times there would arise many false prophets. So you can see that the English Civil War is a key time for this rhetoric of the false prophet and how easily a woman could be accused of being a false prophet. The book of John warns, as I have on the slide here, "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world." Now, chapter 3 of the book investigates a new dimension of the witch, and this is that of the witch as the false prophet. And you can see how this analogy brings the prophet and the witch close together. It demonstrates how this biblical concept of discerning the spirits tied in with the analogy of the witch as the false prophet. References to St. John's text and biblical examples such as Jezebel and the witch of Endor served as a warning against the false prophet and the imperative to try the spirits. This provides another illustration of the overlap of the prophet and witch, with women prophets most susceptible to charges of false prophecy and its close relative, witchcraft. In his Witchcraft treatise published in 1655, on the slide here, Thomas Adey, in his Candle in the Dark, warned against false prophets and witches who worked with the aid of the devil. This rhetoric of the witch as a false prophet resounded in the apocalyptic end of days fervour of the English Civil War and featured in religious debates. Anti-toleration polemicists defending the authority of the Orthodox Church and ministry against the rise of sectarian religions and lay preachers warned against the false prophet and its close relative, witchcraft. Now, bearing in mind, as I've said, the central role of the devil in English witchcraft, I want to return now to the visionary performance. The book starts with Anna Trapnell lying in trance at Whitehall. It's very interesting that she's at Whitehall, which was the seat of political power back then. Now, the female visionary performance with its combined elements of trance, silence, and speech, was crucial for establishing the female prophet's reputation, and it enhanced her spiritual credentials. So there were just a few women who were involved in this ecstatic prophecy who gained reputations and a following. And Anna Trapnell, who features in the book, was one of the main and most famous of that time. Fasting or prolonged periods of self-starvation was a crucial element of the visionary trance. Now, this placed the prophet in a state of physical weakness or illness, signalling the body or empty vessel preparing to receive the spirit. She was often bedridden for days or weeks on end, falling into long periods of silent bodily inertia or fits of trembling, lying in trance. Now, the danger for the prophetess was that the bodily contortions and long periods of stillness resembled those of demonic possession. Audiences played a key role here in discerning the spirits as they watched and judged whether the spirit appearing in the vessel be divine or demonic. So a hostile audience, as we saw in Trapnell's case, could easily transform the godly vessel into a demonic witch. Now, the remaining chapters of the book examine the key religious debates and demonstrate how this slippery dichotomy of the divine and the demonic carried into anti-sectarian discourses and attacks on lay preaching and women's preaching and prophesying. So it wasn't just used against women as prophets, but this dichotomy of God's instrument, Satan's instrument, appeared in all of this anti-sectarian literature. They demonstrate the construct of Satan's instruments was not restricted to female prophets, but featured in broader polemical discourse where religious sectarians and lay preachers were portrayed as the devil's instruments or witches or associated with witchcraft. Pamphleteers and polemicists adopted the trope of Satan's instruments as they warned against the dangers of women overstepping their gender boundaries to preach or prophesy. The concept of the weak or insubordinate woman vulnerable to the devil reveals the role of gender in charges of demonic possession or witchcraft. However, as the book reveals, gender then intersects with politics, as the God versus Satan's instrument dichotomy featured in anti-toleration propaganda and debate over ministerial authority. The pamphlets here, we can see are very gendered, the spirit moving in the women preachers vented against this brazen-faced, strange feminine brew, so attack on women preachers and prophets. And the other pamphlet shows the devil in a carriage riding all over England, spreading his evil amongst the religious sectarians. The Presbyterian minister Thomas Hall lamented that now is a time when heretics, witches, and devils will have their day. The devil, with all his deceits and false promises, along with his witches, drew the gullible, especially women, to join the religious sects. Women were accused of bewitching their husbands to run off and join sectarian religions and then daring to preach and prophesy in their ministries. That in his work, The Pulpit Guarded, Thomas Hall referred to all unlearned preaching as the work of the devil, asserting that all unqualified lay preachers were suffering from the devil's delusions. Now, these chapters point to the wider cultural and religious power issues at play in the fluid God's instrument, Satan's instrument, prophet, witch dichotomies. It also establishes the crucial context, I argue, for shedding light on the female prophet's vulnerability to charges of demonic possession or witchcraft. So my central theme is that it was gender, but also the political and religious context of that time that made these women vulnerable to charges of witchcraft. I just want to mention briefly that there is a chapter on Quakers in the book. Quakers feature in the discussion of the devil's instruments. Now, their religious enemies associated the Quaker sect with the devil and witchcraft and constructed Quaker prophets as the devil's instruments and witches. The silent quaking fit of the Quakers was often likened by their enemies to demonic possession. And there were a large number of female prophets, as I said at the start of the talk, who were found amongst the Quaker sect. And they were also accused of being witches. Now, the final chapter in the book examines the concept of witchcraft as rebellion, and it explores the concept of the rebel witch. Their enemies portrayed female prophets as rebellious to the church and state, and this led to this construct of the rebel witch. One of the charges brought against Anna Trapnell, as I mentioned earlier, was that of stirring up rebellion. This final chapter again exposes the role of power and conflict in the construction of the rebellious prophet as the demonic witch. The chapter begins by examining the construct of the prophet Trapnell as the quintessential anti-authority rebel witch, and it then turns to the broader context to illustrate how the concept of witchcraft and rebellion operated as a discursive device in political and religious polemical debates. Citing Samuel's text, rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. Rebellion against the church and state as witchcraft. This biblical analogy appeared in attacks upon independent religion and lay preachers, but also in sermons and restoration discourses to argue for the re-establishment of the monarchy and the established church. Now, acts of rebellion could refer to a rejection of God or the divine authority of the king, and the construct of the rebel witch featured in royalist and anti-Cromwellian propaganda. Church of England ministers, as well as advocates for the Presbyterian Church, adopted the analogy of witchcraft and rebellion in their attacks on toleration and religious independence, and it reveals religious and political powers struggling to assert and maintain their authority. So, like the female visionary prophet, here I argue the witch becomes a potent symbol of rebellion and a threat to political and religious order. So my book wants to show how the witch needs to be understood in this broader political context, and how witchcraft didn't just refer to those malevolent old women, but appeared as a feature in these debates. Oh, I did have a slide on Quakers there. So just to show that there are many references to Quakers and witchcraft, some pamphlets here I've just got on the screen, and an interesting image at the bottom here of a Quaker with the devil standing behind her by the same artist who did the cover image of Trapnel with the devil. And you can see the resemblance. So this really illustrates this widespread prophet witch and the role of the devil, so that spread right through to Quakerism. And very interesting, the similarity of those images. They're slightly different, but very similar. So, sorry, I skipped this slide before. I thought I had one. But yes, there is a chapter in the book devoted to the Quakers because they are very prominent at this time. So I'll now just make some concluding remarks. And female prophecy drew much attention and a following from all ranks and genders of society. But as my book shows, in a context of revolution and power conflict, a divine instrument could be discerned as demonic, and the female prophet transformed into the devil's instrument, or a witch. My book offers a new perspective as it situates the fluid prophet and witch categories within their broader framework of key religious and political debates. And this is set against the apocalyptic and politically charged backdrop of the English Civil War and interregnum periods. Now, in this context of division and conflict, witchcraft was not only used to persecute and silence women claiming power as prophets, but also widely implemented as a polemical device to exert power and to discredit political and religious enemies. Essentially, my book, Prophets and Witches, moves the focus away from the stereotype of the witch as a malevolent old woman to a powerful symbol of disorder and resistance. And on that note, I will finish, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debra. What a wonderful last line. A powerful figure of resistance rather than a silly old woman. That is superb. And I think we'll thank you very much. Very, very thrilling and enlightening talk about a very important area in the sense that as women, we're constantly struggling against there's still a superior power of men, as my God, certainly if you look at wars, then you see that they're constantly trying to run the world without listening to women. And I think that, I mean, your talk is extremely topical and a very important talk, very important book in a big, wider aspect. We're not just talking about witches and however people might look at witches. We're talking about the power women may be granted or should be striving and are striving for and are fighting for. And I think you've made a very good case how women have tried and are still battling to get to be heard. And I'm inviting people to ask questions of Debra and maybe make a contribution. And it's marvelous that at this very early hour for you, where maybe the sky is still dark, you have been,
Yes, it is dark. Yes.
you have enlightened us. That's really wonderful. And we have Ravi Malhotra has raised a hand, and we'll find out what Ravi would like to say. I think you're there, Ravi.
Thank
Would
you
you,
for
would
that.
you,
You able to hear me? Yes?
yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, yeah, it was an excellent talk. Uh, I'm somebody who works in at the intersection of law and disability studies, and in fact, there's a piece by a woman who's, by the way, her name happens to be Parish, but I think it's a different spelling. Who's written about demonology, and I think she's now a university president in the United States. But there's a lot of work on witches and the connection to disability studies and mental illness, and demonology is people who actually may have had various conditions, uh, like epilepsy or something else that manifested in medieval times. I was just curious if you had any thoughts. It may be your book didn't get into this, but I'm curious if you had thoughts on the intersection of disability and witches.
Thank you, Ravi, for that interesting question. And it's lovely to see all of this audience light up. I didn't know you were all out there, so thank you for tuning in. Um, Ravi, that's an interesting question. I know with the work that I've done on demonic possession at this time, and the question is, could it have been epilepsy in some cases? And certainly, I think that's a question that is worth asking, whether there were some physical elements to some of these ecstatic trances. And also, an interesting one is that women who claimed religious and prophetic authority were often called mad, um, and lots of references to madness and insanity. So sort of mental disability as well as things like epilepsy. So yes, Ravi, I do think that there is work to be done, and you've already mentioned that there is some work being done in that area, which I would like to look into. So that sounds really interesting, and yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Obviously, what women very often do, as they are still are second-class citizens, is unfortunately pick on themselves. And of course, mental illness will come that way. If you don't become assertive, then mental illness comes more quickly. Francis King has raised his hand. Francis, would you like to ask a question?
Am I audible? You can hear me, yeah?
Yes, yes.
Okay, yes, very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating talk, Deborah. I noticed from the pamphlets you showed, the great bulk of them seem to me to be pamphlets written by people who are critical of these women. I was wondering, how much information is there about the actual content of their prophecies and what they were saying? I mean, if you spent half an hour at the bedside of Anna Trapman in Whitehall, what would you have heard? I mean, do we know much about that, or is it all through the kind of the voices of their enemies, so to speak?
Yeah. Thank you, Francis, for your question. Now, these women did have their supporters. They had a great following, particularly against those who were aligned with their beliefs. And, for example, amongst the Quakers and religious sectarians, these women were given a voice. On the other hand, we have as I said, chapter 1 explores women's prophecies, and a lot of this prophecy was aimed at the establishment and declaring that, with Christ's return, this end of days rhetoric, and a lot of it was very powerful, was aimed squarely at Cromwell. They saw him as an imposter, that he was a big letdown. He was meant to stop all the power and corruption, but he was no better than the king. Very much against the learned ministry, who were corrupt and just wanted to collect their tithes. So their prophecies, as I said, wasn't so much foretelling the future, although there was an element of that. They would prophesy on army battles and so on. Most of it was declaration aimed squarely against the church and the state. So this is why they got a lot of copped a lot of flack, a lot of feedback. But these texts that I look at, yes, they are against women as prophets, but I have to put that in the broader context where there's this backlash against lay preaching and prophesying by men and women. So women's prophesying was just a symptom of how things were just getting completely out of control, in the words of these ministers and supporters of established religion. So yes, they did create enemies because their prophesying, as I said, carried a very strong political dimension to it. So I hope that answers your question, Francis.
Okay, thank you very much,
Yeah.
Deborah. We have David Morgan, and then we're going to have Ariel Hessayon. David, it's your turn. Where is he?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Thank you for that.
Yes.
I'll keep the visuals off because I'm already getting ready for bed.
Lucky you.
In different time zones.
Yes.
Thanks for that fascinating talk. Can I just mention about the 270 women prophets that you mentioned that have been identified? First of all, have they got identities, as in names and whatever? And were most of the women accused of witchcraft, were they older women? Because I'm thinking of the accusations of witchcraft. People in earlier centuries, Anne Boleyn was accused of being a witch. And she was identified as being a witch because they said that she had some physical deformity. Like, I don't know whether it's true or not. She's supposed to have had 6 fingers and some other deformity. I think it was three nipples or something. I don't know if I can use that word.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of an alternative word. And she wasn't an old woman. She was a young attractive woman, according to the paintings of her. Another famous case is Joan of Arc, who was obviously burnt as a witch. But the political dimension of that is obvious. She challenged the English involvement in her country, so she was obviously a national heroine in that respect. And Shakespeare was demonising her as in Henry VI, Part 1, as a witch. So there's this issue of what was the identity of the witches, and is there evidence of how physical deformities were used against the people who were accused of being witches? And obviously, the political dimension is obvious to me. I'm thinking of Arthur Miller's play *The Crucible*, which is a work of genius in many respects because it does bring the politics and the ramifications of these accusations together. And he obviously related that to McCarthyism. But so there is that political dimension, which is obvious. But the question of the identity of the witches is the main question I wanted to make. And thank you for that excellent talk.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, David, for your question. I'll just address the first part of the question. The some 270 women identified as prophets. Now, the historian Phyllis Mack, some of you will be familiar with her book, Visionary Women. She actually catalogues the women prophets and their writings, and a lot of Quaker women prophets. So she, I think, names quite a few of those 270 women who are either named or who published some form of prophetic writing. And the women who were persecuted as witches were typically, as I said, women, and women who were old, spinsters, deformed, were particularly vulnerable in village culture and so on to have the finger pointed at them as witches. So difference, the question on disability before, was, a key indicator that they must be the witch, and that's the reason why my cow is sick. So I think a lot of the work on the European witchcraft persecutions show that there, in many cases, were older women who were targeted in the witch hunts. So anyone who was different, women who were not married, who were childless, women with a physical deformity like a limp or something like this were the targets. So that, it would have been seen that any of those deformities was a symbol of the demonic influence, perhaps. So I hope that answers your question, David. So my book is very much interested in the political element of witchcraft, but I do have to acknowledge that at the time that all of this political element is happening, there was a heightened interest in witches in England at this time. And the example I gave is the Matthew Hopkins witch hunts in East Anglia. And during that time, I think it was a few hundred women were brought before the witchcraft searchers who would search the witch for the devil's mark. Many of these were older women in that case. And they would walk the witch as well to keep her awake. I just want to mention that England had banned the use of torture. It was illegal to use torture against witches, but they got around that by doing things like keeping the accused witch awake, walking the witch so that they were so exhausted they would confess or wait for the devil to appear in the room to prove that she, or in some cases he, was a witch. And these were older people too who found this completely demoralising and exhausting. So I hope that answers your questions, David. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debra. We have Ariel Hesseon next.
Thank you.
And then we have Kenneth Syme and Tony Hodges. Ariel, it's your turn.
Thank you, Debra. Can you hear me okay, everybody? Let me just turn myself up.
Yes.
Yeah, great. That was very, very interesting. A couple of comments, if I may, please, and then a question, maybe trying to relate it from some of the questions we've had already. Listening to everything you've said, I think one of the key concepts here is the notion of inversion, where the witch that you're describing, the antithesis, the opposite of that witch, is the ideal woman. And that it's a classic delegitimation strategy that you're targeting these women because they are precisely the opposite of the ideal construct of the type of society and the role that you want women to operate within that society. And hence rebellion fits very nicely into that section where women are not performing their function within a patriarchal society. On the contrary, they're rebelling and hence they're identified as the witch. And by linking it to the devil, you're reinforcing the millenarian aspect because the appearance of the devil is, of course, a sign of the end of the world. So my question then becomes, tying in some of the previous questions we've had, is in particular the case of Anna Trapnell, but also some of the others. I'm thinking particularly of Francis's question, which is why I put my hand up then. How much of what we read are, or can we be sure, are actually Anna Trapnell's words, and how much of it is mediated by male amanuensis, given the fact that this is a teenager who's been living off bread and small beer, is bedridden for several times. How much of that message is being shaped with contemporary political considerations, and that she is effectively being a tool in wider political struggles, and it's not really her voice, it's a manipulated form of voice that we're hearing?
Thank you for that question, Ariel, and for your comments. And yes, the woman as that inversion of the ideal woman is very much at the centre of witchcraft persecution. Now, Anna Trapnell, I think you said teenager. I'm not sure if you were referring to a different prophet, because she was not an older woman, but she was an adult, not a teenager. You may be thinking of Sarah White, but because now when Anna Trapnell was in these ecstatic trances, she would have a scribe who would write down, he would describe the atmosphere in the room, who was present, but also record her prophetic utterances. At the start of one of the texts, he actually says that he was having trouble keeping up because she was, really getting off, and, God was speaking through her about the end of the world to come, and Christ's rule and the end of all these powers. So yes, there could be an element of how much, what sort of distortion there is in that scribe and transcription of her words. The other answer I would give is Anna Trapnell did write some of her own prophetic writings, and that was her Report and Plea and her Legacy for Saints. So she does also put her own voice in her writings there. So yes, I could see that when these women are relying on a scribe, there could be some, but most of the scribes are sympathetic. I don't think they would put anything misleading. The scribe at Sarah White's bedside, the child prophet, was the minister Henry Walker, I think, something.
Yes,
who
Henry Jesse.
Sorry?
Henry Jesse.
Jesse, thank you. Jesse, who was a great admirer of her because she was reinforcing all his independent church teachings. And so his transcription of what she was saying, I think, would be quite accurate, or maybe he was putting a bit of polish onto it. I don't know. So I hope that answers your question. I agree that there could be some inaccuracies with the scribe, but Anna Trapnell also does leave us with two of her own written works as well.
Thank you very much. So very interesting. We have Tony Hodges. Is this your turn, Tony, to ask a question?
Okay, thank you. Good day, Deborah.
Tony.
I wonder, do you see your analysis as being very specific to the situation in mid-17th century England? I was thinking of the New England persecution of witches, which seems to be more stereotypically patriarchal and misogynistic, given that the religious groups that moved that went to New England were themselves dissenting in terms of their religious beliefs.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony, for your question. My work is very much focused on that period in English history. I think it's quite unique in the way that witchcraft is used as a political and a rhetorical tool in the political and religious discourses and conflicts of those times. I haven't done a lot of work on New England at the same time, but that is an interesting point that you make, that it's quite a different context. It's more of this sort of new frontier. There's a lot of fear of the devil. It's quite a different context, and it's more that sort of witch panic and how that easily escalated. And I know that religion did play quite a key role in those Salem persecutions, but the context that I look at is interesting in England because of this context of political and religious upheaval, where the witch becomes this symbol, as I've said, of rebellion and resistance. So yeah, quite different contexts, and quite, it really brings to light the different kinds of witchcraft persecutions and the importance of context in the way and the different emphases, whether it's, as you said, misogyny, more of reinforcing the patriarchy, or whether it's also connected to the political context of the time. So, as my book says, context is crucial for the interpretation and understanding of the witch, whether that's cultural context or political context.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you very
Tony,
much.
for your question.
Thank you very much. I think that's very, very true. We have Kenneth Syme. Kenneth, would you like to speak?
Thank you, and thank you very much, Deborah. You mentioned the strong political dimension to some of the women you were describing. To what extent did their political ideas influence other groups around at the time, the levelers, the diggers, etc.? And to what extent were any of their ideas adopted or developed by other political elements around at the time of the Civil War? I accept that, given that there is not much that survives of their own writings, apart from the writings by Anna Trapnell that you mentioned, do we know to any level of detail what their key political ideas and drivers were? I'd just be interested if you could develop that side of these women in a little more depth. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kenneth, for your question. Now, in terms of the women's prophetic writings, there are, I think, at least about 200 or so prophetic texts that exist. So we do have this great genre of writing that we can examine. Now, the women that I look at were associated with different churches, independent churches or religious sectarians. For example, Anna Trapnell was part of the Fifth Monarchist Independent Church in London, a very radical church, millenarian, end of days, anti-Cromwellian church. And Anna Trapnell gained quite a lot of influence within that congregation, and she was actually then invited by other Fifth Monarchists from Cornwall to please come down and spread your magic down here, and you will be well received, and many are interested. So yes, these women were at the forefront of some of these religious sects, and as I've mentioned, amongst the Quakers, their doctrines of equality. I'm saying in theory, in practice, I think men still, are at the top of the echelons, but in theory, women were given equal voice in Quaker meetings, and a lot of the Quaker women did publish their prophecies and were influential amongst the Quaker sect. And of course, when Anna Trapnell went off to Cornwall to prophesy, she stayed at the homes of other Fifth Monarchists, where she again lay in trance. People would come to her window, and this is where she started to draw the ire of the local Presbyterian ministers. And this led to her being reported to Cromwell, that she was speaking against Cromwell, and this resulted in her arrest, the witchcraft accusations, and so on. So yes, these women were very much involved in the politics of their church or religious sect. So I hope that answers your question, Kenneth.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to ask a question. I know you're talking about England, but you know, in the Middle Ages in Europe, of course, there were the Catars in south of France and northern Italy. And I mean, the persecution of these people, these communities, which were run by women, was it was quite enormous. I mean, the women were also burned and hunted down and so on. And so I'd like, I don't know if you have studied any of these. I also wondered if you've come across the book that I've used a lot for some of my work, A History of Their Own, and it's by Bonnie Sanders Anderson and Judith Senses, and they write it's women in Europe from prehistory to present time, and it's extremely interesting because their line throughout the book is that women's power in being involved in preaching and prophesying and baptizing and so on, it rose and fell. It rose and fell throughout the ages, dependent on whether in the religious circles the male body of religious body was certain of where they were going, or whether they were unsure and they were looking for new ways and they were at a loss. And at such times, women rose. I mean, for instance, you may know Hildegard von der Bingen was a woman who became a powerful preacher and plant herbalist and so on in Germany at the time. She was allowed to do that. She was respected when obviously other women weren't. But it's very interesting how the political, like you're saying, the context is all. So the context, as they describe in this book here, is always, if there's uncertainty, women can come up a little bit in the world. And when there's certainty about religious dogma, the monasteries, everything was closed down, the nunneries that they were running, everything would just be closed down again. The money ceased to be given to them. It was quite interesting how that showed what you're talking about, the context of the situation.
Yeah. Thanks, Greta, for those comments. It really does, I think, illuminate what I've been talking about. I haven't done a lot of study of some of those earlier women. I do touch on them in my book as an illustration, as you say, of how women could, even as the weaker vessel, in my context, these women would claim that we're weak, but this gives us, the power of God's Spirit is more powerful within us. So, and a lot of these women were respected and revered as prophets in some circles, but then in other circles where they sort of ruffled feathers, they risked being demonized as the devil's instruments or witches. And I think that is a recurring theme throughout European history, as you say, Greta, that there were times where women could rise above patriarchal restraints and achieve, particularly in religious matters of religion. I think it gave women avenues to claim authority and spiritual
Absolutely,
credibility as prophets or preachers, for example.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I'll just take that as some interesting comments, Greta, and some more wider reading for me. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I think Steve Freeman, we haven't heard Steve yet, I think.
Thank you. And just in passing, Greta, you did sort of show us a book, but before I could see what it was, you moved again. So just at the end, perhaps you could just show us that book.
Yeah.
And thank you, Deborah, for a really interesting and stimulating talk.
Pleasure.
I'm going to sort of follow up with what Ken said previously, in terms of patterns here. So I think you mentioned Catherine Chidley, and I don't know, not Elizabeth, the leveler leaders. Now, I wonder to what extent, because you mentioned Catherine, I think.
Yes.
To what extent, as the leaders of the levelers, they would have been preachers, probably. I don't know, but I mean, I'm just asking a question. Do we have any more information about them? And just to put it in a context, it would seem to me that in the course of the rise of the revolution, then the enemies of the revolution would use witchcraft as a kind of weapon against the revolution. And then when the revolution is defeated, which it is in early 1649, with the defeat of the levelers, then the women prophets are more likely to become witches at that point as a part of the counter-revolution, if you like. The position of women was going backwards at that point, I would imagine, because it would have gone up through the revolution. So is there a pattern of this witchcraft prophet, this dialectic between witchcrafts and prophets that follows the pattern of the revolution? So it's Catherine Chidley and that. Yeah. And Greta.
Yeah, very interesting question. Thank you. Thank you so much, Steve. I hadn't really thought of that. So it's really raised something for me to think about. The only I do look at Catherine Chidley because she has a very interesting exchange with Thomas Edwards, who is this key anti-leveler, anti-sectarian, anti-toleration writer who wrote Gangrena, amongst other things. And he and Catherine Chidley actually have a published debate about one arguing Catherine Chidley for independence and toleration, and Thomas Edwards arguing against toleration because it's let all these crazy religious sectarians and churches come to the fore, and it's also taken away the absolute authority of the ministry. So we have this very interesting exchange. Now, I'm not sure about the levelers, how many other levelers may have engaged in this sort of toing and froing and debate, but Catherine Chidley stands out because she was respected amongst the levelers and her church as a preacher. So back to Greta's comments, these women could come to the fore in particular contexts, and she was respected amongst the levelers as a preacher. Now, I'm not sure that we could say that with the end of the revolution, women's, persecution of witches increased. The Matthew Hopkins witch hunts were sort of 1647-ish, around that time. And also in the 1650s, during Cromwell's rule, was a time of increased. He had a general doctrine of toleration, so this allowed independent churches and religious sectarians to flourish, and this gave birth to the Quakers. So women were finding places where they could perform as prophets and preachers amongst these religious sectarians of the 1650s. So if I haven't misunderstood your question, I don't see that women were silenced then, because they did find ways to speak and prophesy during the 1650s. It was probably more with restoration.
That's what I'm going to say. Restoration.
With restoration in 1660s, that these voices just seemed to fall silent. And maybe further research is to see if they recur again. I know in the late 17th century that there's a lot of anti-Quaker literature published again, so I'm going to maybe look into that and why that happened, what was the context. But yeah, I think And I think because women were really coming to the fore as prophets, and the religious sectarians were spreading, the Quakers were spreading all over England, that this witchcraft language really came to the fore and became a real feature of these anti-sectarian, anti-toleration discourses. So I think the witchcraft persecutions in terms of witch hunting stopped then at the end of the 1640s, but this language of witchcraft really comes to the fore. So it's just two very interesting contexts and how they interplay. So yeah, that's a good question, Steve, and something to think about some more.
It's so very interesting, isn't it? In a way, once you look at society with women as well, as for instance, I like to do a lot of art history, and I find when you look at art, paintings and so on, you find a lot more women in history, in art, than you find in a history book.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. So in a way, art history, going to the galleries, you see a lot more of the life that women and children and animals lead than you see in a history book written mainly by men.
Exactly.
I mean, in our society here, the Socialist History Society, there are very few women there. I'm one of the only ones doing a few things. So
exactly.
So it's an example.
And Greta, and of course, the witch is a woman.
Yeah, exactly.
Depiction of the witch is a woman. In various
we'll just have to be witches. We'll just have to be witches. So that's really wonderful. It's so very interesting, and it's lovely to meet you on the internet. And thank you ever so much for that talk. That we want to read your book now, and I think we had a very good discussion as well. As you know, if ever anybody who's not in the Socialist History Society, it's a very good organization because you can have these talks and you can look at them afterwards because we have them recorded. So even if you can't make it that evening, you can look at them later on. So thank you very much, Debra.
That's helpful. That's helpful for we in different time zones. I just wanted to thank you all for joining me. I know it's a little bit late now over in London and England. And I just want to say that the sun has come up.
Oh, wonderful. The sun has come up.
It is now light. Yes.
And the sun has gone down for us. It went down at 9 o'clock. And I just flag up this book again. I don't know if you can see it. It's
yes, the history of their art.
It's a wonderful resource. It's 1989, I think. It's that sort of the writers are Bonnie S. Anderson and Judith P. Zinser.
Thank you.
Z-I-N. So
looks like a great book.
It is wonderful reading in it again and again and just finding how the women's power waxes and wanes.
Yeah. Thank you, Greta.
Yeah. Well, we wanted to wax, get bigger.
Yes.